The blueprint, two visions of armored warfare. To understand this clash, we must go back to the beginning, to the 30s, when both Germany and the Soviet Union were like fanatical alchemists, each trying to find their own philosopher's stone, the perfect formula for a tank. Germany, doctrine and cold pragmatism. The Treaty of Versailles, which humiliated Germany, placed severe restrictions on the development of armored vehicles. But this became a catalyst for unconventional thinking. German military theorists like Heinz Guderian formulated the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. In this doctrine, tanks were not just steel fortresses for infantry support. They were the spearhead, a sharp blade meant to break through the front lines and, without getting bogged down in protracted battles, rush deep into the enemy's rear, sowing panic, destroying communications, and encircling entire armies. Within this doctrine, the concept of two main tanks was born. The Panzer III was the main battle tank, the tank fighter. Its primary task was to engage and destroy enemy armor. Hence its initial armament, a rapid-firing 37mm gun. The Panzer IV was the support tank, the artillery tank. Its role was to be the second fiddle. It was supposed to follow the threes and suppress the targets they couldn't: bunkers, machine gun nests, concentrations of infantry. For this, it was given a short-barreled 75mm howitzer, firing primarily powerful high-explosive shells. Remember this dichotomy. The IV was Cinderella from the very start. It was not prepared for duels with its own kind. It was prepared for the dirty work. And in this, there was a cold German pragmatism. The first modifications, OSF, A, B, C, were essentially experimental. The IV truly became a mass vehicle with the OSF, D, and especially the E and F1. But its main ace in the hole, its universal chassis and potential for modernization, would reveal itself later. The Soviet Union, genius, audacity, and mass production. The Soviet tank school of the 30s was, without exaggeration, one of the most advanced in the world. They experimented with everything: multi-turreted monsters, the T-35, amphibious tanks, huge wheel-tracked vehicles. But the main breakthrough was born in the design bureau of Mikhail Ilyich Koshkin. The task was fantastic: to create a tank that would surpass all existing counterparts in three key parameters: firepower, protection, and mobility. And all this under the condition of future mass production. The result was the T-34, a machine ahead of its time. Its key features were not just novelties. They were a revolution. Sloped armor, a genius solution in its simplicity. An angled armor plate increases its effective thickness. A German shell, hitting a sloped 45mm plate at a 60-degree angle, met resistance equivalent to 90mm of vertical armor. This was passive protection that didn't weigh down the design. The V2 diesel engine, 500 horsepower, powerful, economical, and, critically important, less fire-prone than the gasoline engines of German tanks. The diesel provided tremendous power-to-weight ratio and operational range. The long-barreled 76mm gun. From the very beginning, it was a weapon capable of effectively engaging any armor of the period. The T-34 was not just a tank. It was the embodiment of a new philosophy: technological simplicity, repairability, mass production. It was created not for parades, but for war. A brutal, total war of annihilation. The economic backdrop: steel and volts. Behind these engineering breakthroughs stood the economic systems of the two powers. Germany, by 1941, controlled almost all of Europe. The Skoda factories in Czechoslovakia, French steel mills, Norwegian alumina, all worked for the Reich. But German industry was geared towards quality, towards the piecemeal assembly of complex mechanisms. This was both its strength and its weakness. The USSR had gone through the terrible years of industrialization. A country that just 2 decades prior had been agrarian, at the cost of incredible strain, had created a giant industrial potential. The emphasis was on simplicity and mass production. The tank had to be like a Kalashnikov rifle, reliable, simple to produce and master, and there had to be very, very many of them. In the summer of 1941, these two worlds, These two philosophies collided head-on. And for the Germans, this collision was a profound shock. Act 2. Shock and awe. 1941. The Panzer IV's panicked retreat. The June dawns of 1941. German armored spearheads, like hot knives, cut into the Soviet defenses. The Panzer IV F1, the very one from our first table, confidently smashed Soviet fortified areas. Its short-barrel gun was an excellent tool for destroying pillboxes. The crews felt like masters of the situation. And then, the encounter. Out of the dust and smoke emerged strange, swift silhouettes. Narrow tracks, a flattened turret, a long barrel. The T-34. What did a German tanker, the commander of a Panzer IV F1, feel in that moment? He sees the target. He orders fire. A shell from his 75mm KWK 37L/24 flies out at a relatively low velocity. He sees a flash of impact on the hull of the Soviet tank. And nothing. The shell ricochets off the sloped armor like a pea. The German is in a panic. Now it's the T-34's turn. The Soviet gunner catches the familiar rectangular silhouette of the IV in his sights. A shot. The 76mm armor-piercing shell BR-350A, accelerated to a speed of 660 meters per second, pierces the 50mm frontal armor of the German tank like a tin can. Inside, a flash, shrapnel, death. The battle lasts seconds. Here is the statistics from our first table come to life in a real battle. Armor penetration at 500 meters. The Panzer IV F1 has a pitiful 40 to 45 millimeters. The T-34 has 60 to 70. The difference is a death sentence. Armor. The vertical 50 millimeters of the 4 versus the equivalent 90 millimeters of the 34 slope. German memoirs are full of descriptions of this horror. The T-34 could mercilessly shoot down Panzer IVs from a distance of 1,000 meters or more, remaining almost invulnerable. The Germans called it tank terror. What was left for the crews of the fours? Only one thing: tactical skill and cold blood. They could not fight the T-34 in a frontal duel. They were forced to resort to tricks. Flanking attacks. To come from the side, from the rear, where the T-34's armor was thinner. Ambush defense. Using the terrain for camouflage. Concentrated fire. Several fours would fire at one T-34, trying to immobilize it or cause panic in the crew. Calling in artillery support. The 88mm flak anti-aircraft guns became the Wehrmacht's main anti-tank weapon. In 1941, the Panzer IV lost to the 34 in every category. It was a crisis of doctrine, a crisis of technology. The German command needed an urgent, radical solution. And they found it. The arms race began, a race that would turn Cinderella into a formidable fighter. Act 3, the counterblow. The evolution of the IV, the birth of a predator. The Germans wouldn't be Germans if they didn't react with stunning speed and efficiency. The shock of encountering the T-34 and the KV heavy tanks forced them to reconsider the very concept of a tank. The answer was simple and genius. If the gun doesn't penetrate the armor, you need to install a more powerful gun. And they did. Already in the spring of 1942, the Panzer IV F2 appeared on the front. And a little later, the OSF. This was already a fundamentally new machine. Instead of the short stub, it had a long, elegant, and deadly 75mm KWK 40 gun. Let's look at the numbers. This was a qualitative leap. Muzzle velocity increased from 385 to almost 790 meters per second. Armor penetration at 500 meters, a jump from 45 to 96 millimeters. Now, a German gunner could confidently penetrate the frontal armor of a T-34 from a distance of 800 to 1,000 meters. The balance of power on the battlefield began to rapidly level out. The IV was reborn. From an infantry support tank, it became the main battle tank of the Wehrmacht, its workhorse. The apogee of the Panzer IV line's evolution were the OSF H and J modifications, 1943 to 44. This was the maximum possible upgrade of a design born back in the mid-30s. Armor. The hull front was strengthened to 80 millimeters. The famous 5 millimeter anti-cumulative skirts, Scherzen, appeared on the sides of the turret and hull. They protected against new Soviet shells, both standard and subcaliber, and, most importantly, against handheld anti-tank grenades and anti-tank rifle rounds. Gun. The final version, the KWK 40L/48. A slight improvement in ballistics, but a formidable weapon nonetheless. The price of progress. The tank's weight exceeded 25 tons. The suspension, designed for 22 tons, was working at its limit. The power-to-weight ratio fell, and cross-country capability deteriorated. The speed over rough terrain sometimes did not exceed 15 to 18 kilometers per hour. This was the price of survival. And here we come to a key moment. By the end of 1943, the beginning of 1944, the upgraded Panzer IV OSV became a formidable opponent for the T-34-76. It had returned to parity. Its gun could penetrate the Soviet tank at all realistic combat ranges. But while the IV was evolving, a new opponent was being prepared in the East. Act 4, a new level. The arrival of the T-34-85 and the final chord. The Soviet command understood perfectly well that the modernization of German technology was only a matter of time. By 1943, the 34, with its 76mm gun, no longer had its former superiority. The crews complained about the cramped conditions in the two-man turret, where the commander also had to perform the functions of the gunner, which reduced effectiveness. The answer was the T-34-85, a new, spacious three-man turret. A dedicated commander appeared, which sharply increased the crew's situational awareness and reaction speed. An 85mm ZS-53 gun, a powerful weapon capable of penetrating about 110 millimeters of armor at a distance of 500 meters. Let's open our second table again. Panzer IV OSV. H versus T-34-85. Armor penetration. The 85mm Soviet gun versus the 75mm German one. Parity? No. The advantage is again with the 34. Its shell confidently penetrated the frontal 80mm armor of the IV even at a range of 1,000 meters. Armor. The German 80mm of vertical armor versus the Soviet equivalent of 120mm, 75mm sloped. The Panzer IV once again became vulnerable in a frontal projection. With the appearance of the T-34-85 in 1944, the Panzer IV once again, and this time finally, lost its status as an equal rival. It could fight, it could inflict damage, but in a one-on-one duel situation against the new 34, its chances were slim. Act 5. Behind the scenes of the statistics. The human factor and economics. Now let's step away from frontal armor and millimeters of gun caliber. Because war is not won by these alone. War is won by factories, logistics, and, as trivial as it sounds, by people. Economics, quality versus quantity. This is perhaps the most important aspect of the entire confrontation. Germany. The production of the Panzer IV was complex and expensive. Precision mechanics, high-quality steel, piecemeal assembly. Throughout the entire war, about 8,500 Panzer IVs of all modifications were produced. The figures vary, but that's the order of magnitude. At the same time, the Germans constantly changed the design, made improvements, which hampered the already slow production. They dissipated their efforts on creating wonder weapons, Tigers, Panthers, Ferdinands. These machines were terrifying, but there were few of them. They were unreliable and complex to repair. The Panther, for example, never really got rid of the teething troubles of its chassis. The USSR. The production of the T-34 was put on a conveyor belt. The principle was maximum simplicity and manufacturability. Factories in Nizhny Tagil, Chelyabinsk, Kharkov evacuated, stamped out tanks by the thousands. In total, during the war years, 58,000 T-34s were produced. Of these, about 22,500 were T-34-85s. Imagine this ratio. Almost 7 Soviet tanks for every 1 German Panzer IV. The Germans fought with a piecemeal, quality instrument. The Soviet Union with a steel steamroller and avalanche. On average, a German tank was better. But against 10 similar, albeit slightly worse tanks, it had no chance. The German war economy could not withstand this war of attrition. The human factor, hell inside the iron box. And what did it feel like inside these tanks for the crews themselves? Inside the Panzer IV, a crew of 5 men. Seems spacious? Let me quote from a German memoir. The loader's job in the OSF. H was akin to that of a miner in a coal face. The gap between his back and the turret wall was a matter of centimeters. And in front of him was the massive gun breech, which with every vertical elevation threatened to smash him in the head. On the OSF, J modification, to save costs and simplify production, the electric turret traverse motor was removed. Imagine, you are the gunner. You see an approaching T-34 in your sights. You need to turn the turret towards it, and it weighs 11 tons. And you have to rotate it manually with a huge hand wheel under fire on bumpy, uneven ground. It's hellish labor. It slows down reaction time many times over. Gasoline engine, increased fire hazard. German tankers horrifyingly called their vehicles lighters. Inside the T-34, cramped conditions, especially in early modifications with a 2-man turret. The commander was overloaded. Terrible visibility. The Germans joked that Soviet tankers saw the world through a keyhole. Until the introduction of the commander's cupola on the T-34-85, the view was indeed poor. But there was another side, simplicity. The tank was simple to operate. A new driver or gunner could be trained very quickly. It was also easier to repair in field conditions. It was a true worker-peasant machine. Act 6, Myths and Reality. So who won? The biggest myth we have dispelled is the myth of the T-34's total technical superiority throughout the entire war. No, from 1942 to 1944, the upgraded Panzer IV was a formidable and adequate opponent. It won due to better optics, better communication. A FUG-5 radio was standard in every German tank, while on Soviet ones it was often lacking. Better crew training at the start of the war and tactical mastery. But war is not a duel on a tank range. It is the sum total of factors. The Panzer IV lost, but it did not lose to the T-34. It lost to the Soviet war machine as a whole. It lost to the factories in Nizhny Tagil that stamped out 1,000 tanks a month. It lost to the Soviet tankers who, suffering monstrous losses, learned to fight, adopted tactics, and went on the ramming attack. It lost to the logic of total war, where quantity, multiplied by sufficient quality, will always defeat piecemeal perfection. The Panzer IV was an excellent tank, perhaps the best medium tank of the Wehrmacht. It was adaptable, reliable by German standards, and it was this tank, not the Tigers, that bore the main burden of the fighting. But it faced an opponent it could not defeat by definition, an opponent whose economic and mobilization model proved stronger. The lessons of history. So what we left with in the end? 2 machines, 2 fates. One, born for support, becoming the main one. The other, born as a breakthrough, becoming a symbol. The Panzer IV is a story of cold, forced pragmatism. It's a lesson in how far you can push an outdated design through competent upgrades. The T-34 is a story about the right strategic choice. That in a global confrontation, simplicity, mass production, and repairability are often more important than technological sophistication. When I look at photos of these 2 machines, I don't just see iron. I see 2 opposite approaches to waging war. And in their confrontation lies the key to understanding why the Great Patriotic War ended exactly the way it did. Friends, if this deep dive has gripped you, if you felt the same tension I did while working on it, let me know. Your feedback is everything. Write in the comments. Which crew would you rather be a part of? In the cramped but well-equipped 4, or in the Spartan but reliable 34? What other historical matchups interest you? Sherman versus Panther? The IL 2 Sturmovik versus the Junkers 87 Stuka. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon. Materials like this require a titanic effort, and only your support allows me to make them. Thank you for staying with me until the end. This was a story about iron and about people. Remember them.